Well, let me tell you a little bit on my side, and then I'll turn it over to the next presenter. So, uh, Abraham Christoph and Feigl Malowski, they had 8 children. They lived in a little shtetl a day's walk from Kiev called Ignatovka. Now, I've been told by those who've been there that it was the model for Anatevka in Fiddler on the Roof. The name is very similar as well, but it was a very similar village in Russia, actually what is Ukraine. All right, so the name Kiev should not be foreign if you follow the news. Now, my Zaidi, my grandfather, Shmai ben David, he married Chana Hilda, my Bobby, Anna, and they had a daughter. And Sam, my grandfather, emigrated in 1913, so prior to the Russian Revolution. My Bubby didn't come for until 1921. So he came into Baltimore at that time, and from there went to Chicago. Now, she came years later. In fact, we found the immigration papers and an interview with her. She came in to Ellis Island, and the record shows she had $25 in her pocket, which is what they had to have to come in. And she said she was there and being greeted by her husband, Sam. So he came from Chicago and got her. They stayed in Chicago for quite a while, and then land became available out here in South Haven. There was very cheap farmland that became available, and so a lot of Jews, whether from Chicago or the surrounding area, ended up in South Haven because of that land. She came in 21, the Bolshevik Revolution. Actually, I did a play a number of years ago, and it was based on real people and the interviews coming into Ellis Island. And one of the stories actually matched my Bubby's. She actually had to steal out of Russia, sneak down to the underbelly of Europe, up to Amsterdam, where she caught a boat over. Because if they knew you were coming to the United States, they would not allow it. In fact, I had many relatives who came from there that had to send their mail back to Israel to be dated, posted there, to send back to Russia, because, of course, they opened letters and looking at things, and they would, of course, investigate if it said United States, but it was okay to come from Israel. And this is prior to Israel becoming a state in 48. So they ended up settling here, out east of here, and that's where my parents ended up being born, actually in Chicago. And my aunts were actually born here. My dad's 2 sisters were born here in South Haven. So buying the land out here, I talked about in 28, the show was established downtown here. My Zaidi and probably several others here, their grandparents were probably involved with the building of that. My aunts, Jeanette and Lillian, would marry and move back to Chicago, where they ended up staying. My father, High, who some of you may have known because he was postal supervisor, growing up, I didn't think there was a person in South Haven he didn't know. Between being an insurance, a prudential salesman, and then later with the post office. My grandfather ended up moving back into town and had an accident. A car crushed his legs between another vehicle and his own. And so growing up, I only knew him as being on crutches and canes and so forth. We used to play with them a lot. I don't think my grandfather must have made that unshaven look popular long before Don Johnson in Miami Vice, because I remember as a child him rubbing that against us and getting chafed by that constantly. I don't know, he liked pulling the shirt up and all over, so, which I don't know, my grandchildren picked that up, and I don't know how they did it since he died when I was 8. So it must be genetic, I don't know. So it's very interesting because my father was in the Army, and my mom grew up in Chicago, her family, and my Aunt Jeanette, her future husband, grew up as a neighbor next to my mom. They were lifelong friends, neighbors. And so my mother was there, of course, next door, and my father came to visit his sister and met my mother. So it's kind of odd the fact that, again, growing up next to the in-law type thing, and he met her. My mom always made a point of saying that she actually, that first date was a lunch date because she had a date that night with someone. So she told my dad, you have to have me back by such and such a time. I have a date. I guess he was more persistent. He was more persistent. And I think that might have been, I always told her I could have been tall. She was dating Simeon Cogsburg, which I'm kind of glad that we didn't go that route. High Price was a lot better, but Simeon I guess was in the mob, and they got shot at a couple of times, and she said that was it, so she married Dad. My grandfather, when he came, his brother Charles had told him that we're in America now, you have to have an American name. So they changed the name from Christoph to Price, which is how it got changed. A long time ago, I used to think I'm going to change that back. But the hassle of having to change all the legal things and everybody who knows me as Price, I thought, nah, I'll leave it alone. But I thought Christoph sounded like a great stage name compared to Price. So, and that's how my parents ended up meeting. They ended up moving up here with my grandparents, moved in the house. The house has been remodeled. It was sold a long time ago and been remodeled. I wish we'd kept it. I told my dad, yeah, you're going to get a fair price for it, but they're going to put condos up all over, which they did, so I foresaw that. But he sold it long before that. In the meantime, so they had moved here. What? And so they had moved here and got married in '54. They bought the house that I still own for $8,000, which I figure is it's a great investment. My dad was his own handyman, and so he added on to the house bedrooms and other parts of it. I don't remember the house ever not under construction growing up. All I remember was my brother and I got to use hammers to knock plaster walls down, and that was fun. So we did that part of it. My maternal grandparents, my Bubby and Zadie in Chicago, Louis and Sylvia Chiz. My grandfather died when he was in his 40s from an infection after an operation that today, of course, wouldn't happen. Penicillin would have stopped it. But my Bubby, when she came across in 21 as well, and she was a single woman, and they would automatically send her back. So a family on board the ship adopted her, and she became an Eisenberg. And I tried to figure out as a kid, we had relatives, Eisenberg, and I could not figure that out until I was older and understood the story that she wasn't ever officially adopted legally, but they adopted her. And so there are some people in South Haven that I have a relation to because of that. But she came over as an Eisenberg, met my grandfather, Gary. He became a junk salesman, peddler. My mom and my Uncle Sherm, I remember, they would make up songs about selling, lady, lady, drop your baby, come on out, buy my red tomato, watermelon, watermelon, and, he had songs for all the different things. They had horses in the barn, which they were, again, in the same barn as the Krugmans, who would end up becoming relatives of ours once my dad married my mother and the others there. So, let's see, my grandparents died. I've told people I am bound to lead a very long and miserable life, as all my grandparents and parents died in their 80s. My Bubby Chiz was 93, and bone cancer got her in Chicago. But all of them lived to be very long. They were well known in the community. Again, I was only 8 at the time. I think, as adults, we think all the questions I wish I could have asked them, but an 8-year-old doesn't think about it. To have found out things about life in the shtetl and their early lives in the United States and so on. So that is probably more than you were bargaining for. So I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter.